hopefully you've all managed to get a cup of tea and you found a seat. I'd like to welcome you all to the November meeting of the Housing, Planning and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We shall be with each other for about the next 2 hours or so, and we are quorate. So I'm going to start with item 1, which is the apologies for absence. We have had 2 resignations from the committee since our last meeting. Councillor Anne Stott has resigned and Councillor Rob Chilton has resigned. We've received apologies for absence from Robert Sharp, Elise Wilson, Gillian Peat and Lynn Holland, and I'd like to particularly welcome those substitute members who are joining us today. Councillor Rebecca Moore, Councillor Adrian Pearce, Councillor James Wright and Councillor Peter Malcolm. Thank you very much indeed for enabling us to be quorate today. You are very welcome and we look forward to your contributions to this committee. Councillor Bernard Sharp has been agreed by the Combined Authority as a new member of this committee as a replacement for Councillor Rob Chilton, and Councillor Jamie Walker from Bury will be formally appointed at next week's meeting of the Combined Authority. So, with the resignation of Councillor Anne Stott, that leaves a vacancy in the role of Vice Chair. The Vice Chair, of course, colleagues will recall, has to be a member of a political party that is not the same as the Mayor. So, for these purposes, because I am the Liberal Democrat on this committee, the Vice Chair needs to be a Conservative member of this committee. My understanding is that we have 2 Conservative members with us today, and so one option is to elect a Conservative member as our Vice Chair, or to wait until the next meeting, our December meeting, where hopefully the whole group will be there and elect from the 3. Councillor Sherrington, you're indicating.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I would prefer it to be done today, just in case. You never know, something might happen to you within the next few weeks. I'm not wishing anything on you, Lisa, but you never know these things. So I would like to nominate Councillor Morgan.
Thank you very much. That wasn't in any way sinister. Thank you, Councillor Sherrington. I've got a nomination for Councillor Morgan. Is that nomination seconded? Thank you very much. That's seconded. Are there any other nominations? In which case, are we agreed that Councillor Morgan is our Vice Chair? That is agreed. Thank you very much. Item 2, I have been told of no urgent business. So moving on to item 3, does any member or indeed any officer have any interest that they need to declare for any of the items on this agenda? No. Okay. Item 4 is the minutes of the last meeting. Colleagues will note that they should have received a briefing note on homelessness. That's been circulated to members of this committee. That followed upon some of the questions that were raised about the definition of homelessness and rough sleeping, to make sure we all understood the same terms. We've also received some information on planning appeals. That's been circulated to members of this committee as well. There is one item to follow, which is a short background note to explain how different plans work together. So I remember it was Councillor Elise Wilson was talking about neighbourhood plans and the interaction of such things with GMSF. That's due to come in the future. With that noted, are colleagues comfortable with the minutes? Are we happy to agree that they're a true record? Councillor Walker, can you use your microphone, please?
Sorry, yeah. Just wanted to know, because I thought we'd decided that we were going to have the spatial framework on every agenda, and I can't quite see it anywhere. Maybe it's described as, is it this item 7, is that it instead? Okay, because that list, I do want to ask a few questions about that list of planning appeals when I don't want it to be told afterwards, well, we've dealt with that now. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, so if you've got questions on the note that was circulated,
yes.
I think probably here is the right place to ask those questions, partly because it's an item following up on the minutes of the last meeting. So please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I'm rather surprised, and I just want some confirmation from the officers that how up to date this list is, because it looks like quite a few of the authorities with tranches of greenbelt land aren't having any appeals overturned. And I mean, I did mention to you earlier, but it's somewhere like Stockport, which it's prime developer land, if I can put it like. I don't want to be unkind, but you know, they're more interested in developing there than they are in Wigan.
We've had our first meeting in recent weeks, and one of the things I'd certainly like to table today is whether or not we could have 1 or 2 representatives from this scrutiny committee to work with us on that housing strategy moving forward. I think that whole forward-look approach to scrutiny is something we should develop within Greater Manchester. Scrutiny isn't just about looking at decisions that have been taken and learning from that. It's about actually engaging meaningfully with scrutiny committees to inform the decisions of any executive function. I also think there's another opportunity, and that is the role of the Housing and Planning Commission within Greater Manchester. That's a meeting that's currently open to the public, but I don't think there's a formal relationship at this point in time between this scrutiny committee. I'd have no problem at all with members of this scrutiny committee attending those meetings and potentially influencing the agenda within those meetings around issues and themes that you want to explore within a broader context of engagement. So I'd probably stop on that. I know Steve's going to take us through, Steve Fife is going to take us through the presentation, but that's certainly my opening remarks, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. It's really appreciated.
Thank you very much. This committee welcomes your enthusiasm about working together on that. I think this is a really, really chunky part of our remit as a housing, planning and environment committee. These are issues that affect all of our residents, all of them, and any of the councillors around the table will know from their inboxes what a huge impact it has on residents who are in overcrowded accommodation, who can't find accommodation, who are sitting on waiting lists for housing for months and years at a time. So thank you very much for that. There are slides that have been provided to us in advance. I'm sure I can speak for all of the committee in saying that we've read those slides in detail, so thank you very much for that. I'd be really keen, Steve, if you could pick out the key messages rather than perhaps going through each of the slides in turn. So what are the key things you want us to take from these slides? I'm keen to hear what work's happening across GM and how that fits in there, and how this fits more into the broader strategy approach being taken across GM. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm glad that I'm not traipsing my way through all of those slides, because I'm very aware there are a lot of them, and what we try to do with the presentation is to just kind of uncover, if you like, the complexity of affordability as an issue in the sense that affordability traditionally in housing circles, if you were asked to map affordability, you'd put a map on of house prices and you'd compare that with household incomes, and you'd say, there we go, job done. In those places it's more expensive, and in these places it's less expensive, and therefore it's less affordable. What we try to do with the presentation is to try and unpick that now and talk about the different tenures, the different positions that people are in, and how we relate that to household income. Just to kind of run through the sort of different aspects of that, for me, what we're trying to get away from, but it's hard to, is to get away from averages and totals, which don't really give you often a good picture of what it means for individual households. But when you're looking at things at a GM level, when you're looking at things in terms of the big picture, that's often what we resort to. But in the presentation there, you've got information there around the availability of social and affordable housing. And as Paul mentioned, clearly there's issues about what we mean by social and affordable housing in a formal sense. We talk through the new build situation. We look at right to buy, we look at the affordability of the private rented sector as well as owner occupation, and try to relate that as best we can to household incomes. And that leads to some quite complicated charts, so if we need to talk through any of those in more detail, I'm happy to try and do that. One added complication which we put into the presentation is that the two charts on pages 31 and 32 of your pack are actually identical. So I spent, 5 minutes trying to work out what the difference was, and actually there isn't one because we just put it in twice, so apologies if anyone suffered from that too. We look also at issues around housing need, housing benefit, and how that relates to private rented sector as well as social housing, and some quick summary stats, which I'm sure you've talked through these issues in more detail already, in terms of rough sleeping, homelessness preventions and so on, and also some information on empty homes. I guess from my point of view as an officer, there's an additional challenge which we try not to get to you, if you like, but that's about the data that we have. On some issues that the data is very good and very up to date. On others, particularly the private rented sector, I would say data is sparse and sometimes partial and not always reliable, but we do the best we can with what we can access. Happy to take us into more detail on any of the specific issues there. Some new news out this morning, as at 9:30, CLG produced the latest housing delivery numbers for England. In Greater Manchester, in 2016-17, 7,892 net new homes, which is up 28% from the year before. In England overall, it was up 15%, 217,000. So some news hot off the presses there, which, if we had time, would have featured on one of those graphs, but I'm sure we can update that.
Thank you very much indeed. This committee appreciates the brevity of both of those speakers so far. Okay, colleagues around the table who would like to start questioning our officers. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say that I chair the Homeless Forum for the Borough of Rochdale, and I was also at Andy Burnham's event at Salford University a while back on his strategy there, where I met Mike Wright. And if there's a chance, I'd like to put myself forward to do that. Please.
To sit on to do any of the work that Mayor Dennett mentioned. Thank you very much for that, Councillor Robinson. Are there any other questions from any members? Councillor Robinson.
Can I just confirm on that? So, is it a request to be involved in the 10-year homelessness strategy? Yeah, okay, that's fine. So there's two different things here. So there's a 10-year homelessness strategy and there's the broader housing strategy. But obviously there has to be a relationship between the two. But obviously the event I think you attended was around homelessness, wasn't it? And rough sleeping at Salford University. So yeah, we can take that back to the combined authority and see if we can action that.
Indeed. What I propose we do, just in terms of noting the invitation to join in with the work there, which I think is very welcome. What we might do after this meeting is circulate an email to the permanent members of this committee and ask who would be interested, and then we can make a decision as a committee as to who's best placed and particularly enthusiastic to do that. So thank you very much. Councillor Roberts, you had indicated.
Thank you, Chair. First, if you're going to I think that's a good idea. If you're going to circulate, can you kind of give some indication of when, where, what the commitment would be? Yeah. So my question is that we've got lots of figures here. So what does that tell us we need to do? So kind of what are the priorities? What is it that it means for us? What is it we should be thinking about? If you've got any pointers you'd like to give us.
I mean, I'll just respond to that, because I think what's already come across in the very short contributions, I think, is the complexity of this issue. And what we have before you today doesn't really give us the answers. It asks a lot more questions to some extent. And the Planning and Housing Commission has already commissioned various pieces of work to take this further. So, for example, Mayor Dennett mentioned the waiting list numbers for Greater Manchester, but those waiting lists are all developed on a different basis. So there's a piece of work being commissioned now to try and get underneath that, trying to understand what that really means about housing need. So I guess I'm saying that we're not here saying that there's a set of statistics that give you the absolute answer. And then it gets even more complicated to some extent, because a lot of the issues that we're facing link into deliverability and supply. So a lot of the challenges we will be facing, whatever we decide about affordability, is about the pipeline of development. And so, for example, in terms of affordable homes, there's enough money in the system now over the next 3 years to produce something around 4,000 new affordable homes. But we don't yet have the land lined up to produce that those homes on across Greater Manchester. So even when we work out what affordability should be, what the criteria around that should be, delivering the land supply and the homes is going to be a challenge. So I think it's very complex. There's not one answer. Using my own area, Rochdale, as an example, the difference between social rents, affordable rents, and market rents in Rochdale is marginal. In many parts of Rochdale, there's not really very much difference between that. But that, of course, is very different if you look at central Manchester and Salford. So it's a complexity that we've got to get down, not just to answering those questions, but also to have a spatial view of what that means in different places. I'm sorry that's not really answering your question.
In terms of what do we need to do, the very fact that we're on with a housing strategy is indicative, in my opinion, that we are on with trying to design what we need to do. I think there's a really important point here. Housing is within the purview of the districts currently. It doesn't actually sit within the combined authority in terms of the constitution we operate here. So in terms of designing a housing strategy for Greater Manchester, it'll be a housing strategy that's designed in partnership. It won't necessarily be legally binding, because it can't be, because housing sits within the districts. So your local plans or your core strategies are in many respects what the current position is in terms of what do we need to do to tackle housing. So it's within that area of work I would be arguing certainly we need to look in the short term. What we do know though is we've got a chronic undersupply of social council housing. We also need more extra care facilities, supported accommodation within Greater Manchester. We know there are issues around land availability and land value within Greater Manchester. We have lots of people sitting on pieces of land in the hope that they'll increase in value. As a consequence of that, that then transfers to the developer as a cost. That then pushes up housing prices, which increasingly makes houses unaffordable. We've got big issues with land remediation. So when we talk about brownfield first, money needs to be spent on those plots of land to actually bring them to market, to actually develop those lands. There's also this issue about the relationship between the GMSF and the local plans or the core strategies within the districts, and then what that actually means for housing. And then obviously there's the broader complexities around what's happening in the labour market in terms of what people's income is, precarious employment, welfare reform, and then how that plays out within this conversation around affordability. I mean, that's just a taster, really. It becomes even more complex than that, actually, when you start looking into the detail. I guess for us, though, we're at a point now, or at a juncture where we genuinely do want to work in partnership across the 10 districts around housing, and we want to try and find real meaningful solutions that work for the different demographics of Greater Manchester. And we do want to genuinely try and build truly affordable housing. Just allowing this to be the domain of the market or the private sector developer, as far as I'm concerned, is not going to deliver the results we need. We need strategy, we need clarity of where we want to go in terms of vision, and arguably we need more intervention on the part of the local authority and the combined authority around some of these issues. We're also in the middle of negotiating a housing deal with government, because we believe government have a significant role in this. We're hopeful that the budget announcements, soon to be announced, will make some big announcements around acquiring land, and then that's already found its way into the press and the media recently. So this isn't something that we'll be dealing with in isolation, both as districts or as a combined authority. The government have a significant role to play in addressing what is a housing crisis and a failing housing policy, in my opinion. So hopefully that gives you some assurance, I guess, that we're on with it. This is a project, this is something we've never done before within Greater Manchester in the same way that we're doing it, and we are fundamentally committed to finding solutions for the people of Greater Manchester.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's helpful. And I suppose I would say that it's important that we don't let the complexity get in the way of us identifying some priorities and some action. It's not to say that people don't need to understand that it's complicated, and I think we all know from the discussions we've had previously at this committee about the spatial framework, about, just how sensitive some of these issues are. So, and I suppose it's thinking about, so what does Greater Manchester do best for us that we can't do by ourselves in the local areas? And it's kind of beginning to get to that. And a large part of that, it seems to me, is about some of those broader issues that affect all of us. So the one, land remediation, for example, I think we need to have a very public and positive campaign about why we need that money in order to save the Greenbelt. It's those kinds of issues that I feel that are perhaps best left at Greater Manchester level, because they affect all of us, whereas some of the more detailed stuff about how we intervene in our local areas are probably better left to us, being led by the districts, and then maybe looking at where we can establish some commonality. So I think it's important not to try to get an all singing, all dancing, beautiful bells and whistles strategy. It's more important to pick out who does what best and start getting on with some of it, would be my view.
Oh, start getting on with some of it. There's a radical suggestion. Thank you, Councillor Roberts. I'm going to... did you want to come back on that, or shall I bring in some other colleagues around the table? Please do.
So, you're probably aware through the GMSF work and the objectively assessed housing need numbers that the government have been consulting on recently, that as a whole, we can deal with those housing numbers as Greater Manchester, not as districts, which therefore then leads to, in my opinion, the rational or logical conclusion that actually we do need to start behaving more strategically around the issue of housing, especially if we're going to be meeting housing need as Greater Manchester and not as respective districts. So that forces that agenda in my opinion. I think we are on with lots of stuff within Greater Manchester. I mean, we're doing stuff around tackling homelessness, opening shelters. I know in my city of Salford, we're doing some really interesting stuff around extra care. We're doing stuff around young person accommodation, shared accommodation, working with the registered providers. So please don't think that while we get on with the strategy, we'll be pressing the pause button on actually, pragmatically delivering solutions that we need to deliver yesterday in many respects. That is not the case. So don't see this process as an all singing, all dancing strategy with no real operational plan. I'm not interested in a strategy for the sake of it, so let's be clear about that. I'm actually interested in a strategy that means we've got clarity of vision, we know what we're doing, but actually the more interesting part of it is the operational plan that underpins that and galvanises, if you like, Greater Manchester to deliver real meaningful outcomes that we are publicly accountable for. So.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Wilson, then I'm going to bring in Councillor Malcolm. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that the definition of how affordability was a contentious one. I just wondered whether there was an agreed definition across Greater Manchester, because I know there are conversations that are being had about linking that to income rather than market value. The second question is about the private rented sector. The graph shows that there's a high concentration of that around the centre of the conurbation, and knowing Manchester, and I'm guessing the same pattern will be true in central bits of Salford and Trafford, is that once you get past the city centre apartments, a lot of that is poor quality, cramped, with landlords who are of variable standards. So I wonder what your ask of central government was in terms of regulating the private rented sector in terms of both price and quality, if you have any.
Second one, because you've been involved in the housing deal negotiations with government. Affordability, there isn't an agreed definition across Greater Manchester. In many respects, the housing strategy is part and parcel about how we arrive at that. There are massive problems here. So when government talk about affordability, you'll know this, they talk about 80% of market value. So there's no real relationship there with people's income and what's happening within the labour market. And also the point that Steve made earlier around data, I think is a really, really important one, because quite often what we rely on is national data sets. And then when you start to look behind some of the methodologies that underpin those data sets, you quickly realise they're problematic in genuinely understanding what's happening in the labour market out there. We've got some big challenges with low paid employment, 0-hour contracts, part-time pay. I'm acutely aware of some of this just from some of the visits I've done recently to care homes in the city of Salford. So, understanding what's going on in the labour market is a real challenge for us. And in my opinion, I don't think we can solely rely upon national data sets to actually provide us with that information. But that shouldn't stop us from trying to do that, in my opinion. One of the things we're going to be launching within the city of Salford in the imminent future is a Fair Rents Commission. And that's all about exploring this issue of affordability, specifically within the private rented sector, with a view to potentially running something like that pan Greater Manchester, to engage with people in their households to actually understand, how much they're spending on rent, or their mortgage, and how much they're left with it ultimately at the end of the month to live on. So these are important issues because, you know, I'm acutely aware, you know, people in low-paid jobs are really struggling out there. They're really struggling.
Yeah, just some brief comments. In terms of an appetite from government to have more regulation of the private rented sector, I think there is none. So we've not got any particular traction with that. I think there's just two other comments though. I think there is something about whether we're always using the powers that we have, and sometimes we don't because we haven't got the capacity largely to do that. So I think there are things that we're not already doing. And I think the other thing to recognise is that we've got a different kind of private rented market emerging at the moment, which should and is being less problematical for us, because as you get big institutional investors involved in that market who are investing for the long term, they have a different view about how that product should be managed. And so I think certainly some of the in the urban core, some of the more recent private sector developments will, I think, be much less of a problem than some of our traditional problems that we've had. So simple answer is we're not really getting any traction on additional powers. I think there's a challenge for us in districts about whether we're using the powers we've got as effectively as we could.
I mean, I'd just say on that as well, landlord licensing, for example, is a way to influence quality of service provision and also empower tenants within those properties. The other thing we're also looking at and talking with is tenants' unions. There's a real appetite at the moment within Greater Manchester, it would seem, amongst private rented individuals to establish a Greater Manchester Tenants Union. And what that's about is ensuring that people understand their rights within private rented accommodation. So it's almost a rights-based model. And the early conversations I've had around this with interested parties are that they see technology as an opportunity to, you know, share people's rights in an easy way, because if you look at various housing legislation, it's quite complex to understand, you know, what your rights are within all of that, really, at the end of the day. So we are looking at these issues from different perspectives, so empowering private sector tenants themselves, and also looking at what we can do through landlord licensing. But I think, as Steve said, in terms of the housing deal we're negotiating with government at the moment, this certainly isn't high on their agenda.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start grouping some questions together because I've had 5 further councillors indicate. I've got Councillor Malcolm, Councillor Morgan, Councillor Moore, Councillor Sherrington and Councillor Walker have indicated. So I'm going to take Councillor Malcolm and Councillor Morgan together. Councillor Malcolm.
Thank you, Chair. Yesterday, the BBC ran a story on social housing saying the ministers have moved debt from the housing associations to boost building. They're going to classify them as private bodies and remove £70 billion of debt from them. Is this a positive story? Is this going to have any effect on Greater Manchester, or is it just a bit of a political stunt? Or do you know anything about it?
Councillor Morgan, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Steve mentioned earlier the new hot off the press data with regards to the amount of houses we built 16-17, and it's good news that we obviously seem to be significantly higher than the national average. We've increased the amount by 25% compared to 15, I think you said. That said, did we meet what was our actual target for house building for 16-17? By default, did we meet it or exceed it?
Who's going to go for that one then?
I'll take the first question, shall I?
Please do.
Good news or bad news, that statement. I think it's been a bit of an in-out situation over a number of years now. I think it's probably got more about removing that borrowing from public spending than about driving housing growth. So I don't think that's really the key mechanism that it's aiming to do.
It's cynical of you.
And that sounds cynical, but it does tend to be that the government have taken a different view depending on where they've been in an economic cycle. It may have some impact, some beneficial impact, of course, but...
Eamon, you'd like to come in?
If I could just to echo what Steve said, the only people that the government has taken debt off is the government. because the Office of National Statistics forced them to classify housing associations as regulated bodies and therefore put all the debt onto the public balance sheet. What they've now done is found a way of overturning that. So the housing associations owe exactly the same amount they owed before, but it doesn't appear on the Treasury's balance sheet as of yesterday, which means the Treasury, in theory, would be more relaxed about the associations going out and, registered providers going out and borrowing more in order to build more. So it might have a marginal impact, as Steve has said, but it is a bit of a, it's sort of a three-card trick, but without bothering with any more than one card, to be honest.
Thank you. Councillor Moore, you indicated, I'm then going to bring in Councillor...
My question was...
Sorry, hold on, sorry. Councillor Moore. Councillor Morgan, are you wanting to come back? Respond to the question that was asked, please.
Yes, if I could. The short answer is no, we haven't met our targets, hence our ongoing consultations on the housing deal and other efforts that we're trying to make to raise housing delivery. So just to repeat the numbers, 7892 is the number that came out this morning for 2016-17. I think the consultation from CLG on the need numbers sets it as 10780. I'm looking at Anne, hoping she'll 708. 10708 is what government suggests we should be delivering.
Can I just say also on that point, when we were talking earlier about meeting housing need and how we can deal with this as Greater Manchester, I'm pleased to say that Salford contributed nearly 2,500 units to that number we're talking about here. So in terms of urban density, the stuff that Andy Burnham talks about, we're already on with doing that, I guess is what I'm saying, because a lot of the growth that we've seen in the city of Salford has been in close proximity to the city centre and certainly around Odsal. So urban density is live and kicking, and we're already doing that sort of thing within Greater Manchester.
Okay, I'm going to come to Councillor Sherrington and then Councillor Walker. Councillor Sherrington.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for all the statistics, but at the end of the day, when we're trying to deal with the strategy, I think that what we need is the vision or the way forward that each individual district sees what they're going to do. We're getting snippets of what's happening here and happening there, but we're not getting the overall vision of each individual district. And I think unless we can do that, we can't really move on for what's called best practice and or even pinching ideas from each other. Now I know at an higher level that's probably all going on, but as a scrutiny I do think that we need to know what those kind of things are that are going on so that we could probably push in our own districts in a particular direction because we're aware of these things. So I do think that that's the kind of information that we probably would like to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sherrington. Councillor Walker, you'd indicated.
Yeah. I'm just going back to Councillor Roberts' point right at the beginning, because it was really, so what? You know, what have we gleaned from that? And I do think that we can spend years getting all these statistics and wonderful stuff together. I think one of the things that we are aware of is that the Mayor is keen that we tackle homelessness. So that's, you know, a clear strategy that we I think we're all committed to be honest, and we're all and whether we like it or not, from 2018 we've got a new act to contend with as well. So even those who aren't doing much are going to have to do something. But it does strike me that if we're going to set ourselves some targets, the most difficult area and the people who are the least flexible are the poorest people in our communities. You know, in truth, the sort of the people that are attracted, for instance, to a lot of the new build that we're building, are a lot more mobile. They are more comfortable with moving about, but we find that in our own areas, you know, within my borough, I can't get them to move from one side of the borough to another, the poorest people, whereas the people who are better off and who are going for the new housing, they'll happily move, and they'll move from Manchester and Salford and West Lancs. So I do think that that's the area where we really have to think through how we're going to do this. Very clearly, it is a district function, but we need to be, it feels to me, part of the solution as well. Because I mean, there's some social engineering in all this, whether we like it or not. If there's no jobs in an area, having more and more houses for no jobs is not the best of solutions. So it does feel to me like, rather than waiting a long time to get that overall strategy, I'd like to have one or two things that we can pick out, that we can say, actually within the next 6 months, here's some targets that we're actively working towards. So I look forward to something along those lines. But let's go for the possible rather than the impossible, because, you know, setting ourselves impossible targets will just set us up to fail. And it'll put us off doing the stuff where we can make a difference. So I just think we've got to keep on coming back to what we can do incrementally. We can't suddenly change the world, but we can make incremental changes there that will affect, you know, people across Greater Manchester. But let's look at particularly about that, our poorest people, and how we can do something for them. But I think it's also worth saying that in Wigan, for instance, but I'm sure it'll be the same in Rochdale and probably in Oldham and one or two other areas, there's not a massive housing shortage. You know, there's if you want a council house in Wigan, it's not that hard to get one. If you want one in your little area, you might have to wait a long, long time. But the least popular areas, you can get one very, very quickly, as long as you've got a reasonable track record, or even a moderate track record. So,
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Wright has indicated, is it on that point, or would you like me to bring you in a moment? In a moment, and I've also noted that you would like to speak, Councillor Pearce, as well. Would you like to address those, Steve?
Yeah, in terms of Councillor Sherrington's point, I think all districts are fully engaged in the Housing and Planning Commission, so that's the at a political level, so all leads on housing and planning are involved in that, and there are various officer groups that support that work. So we are starting to build an infrastructure, a governance infrastructure that enables us to share that learning, as you suggest, is required. So I think that is, it's probably, we're also at the next meeting in December, we're reviewing the governance arrangements for that. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to strengthen that, and I think that goes back to what Councillor Dennett was saying earlier about your involvement in some of that work going forward. In terms of Councillor Walker's wide-ranging points, just to pick out some of the key points of that, I think it may well be the case that access to homes in places is easier, but if you look at the long game, what we know is that we've got a massive residential growth challenge in Greater Manchester, and that's what the evidence base for the GMSF that's being refreshed at the moment was telling us. And that goes back to the housing numbers that were mentioned earlier. We are still massively under delivering against those numbers. So there is a big challenge, I think, about bringing that forward. And I think it's important also to reflect that often GMSF gets a public focus that's around production of homes. But remember, that plan was equally about the spatial planning for employment as well. And I think that gives us a massive opportunity to bring together the housing growth alongside jobs growth with infrastructure in a way that we've not had before, because we're doing it at that greater spatial level across the whole of Greater Manchester. So I think, but I think it's important not to underplay the challenge that that presents for us over the next 20 years. Great opportunity too.
Thank you. Councillor Wright and then Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chair. As Councillor Walker said in Wigan, that there's not a particularly long wait for housing. I can assure you in Trafford that couldn't be further from further different. The waiting lists in Trafford are sheer absolutely ridiculous, and the availability of social housing in Trafford is extremely poor. As seen from the statistics, we have the lowest number of social housing units in Greater Manchester. On the point of land, which was discussed very early in the presentation, are we putting any pressure on the government regarding use it or lose it? Because as far as I'm concerned, I think we need to be quite radical when it comes to, we've got a housing crisis in this country. Now, whether the government agrees on a use it or lose it policy, I very much doubt they do, but land banking is a major problem across Greater Manchester and particularly in Trafford. And as far as I'm concerned, we've got to be quite radical when it comes to getting hold of land for housing, be it private housing, be it affordable housing, be it social housing. And I think a lot of pressure needs to go into pressing the government into that type of policy, because I think the only way that we solve the housing crisis is by becoming quite radical and saying to landowners, you either use that land or you lose that land. It's as simple as that. On the point of the difference between social rents and private rents, which was discussed earlier, which was that there isn't a great deal of difference in certain parts of the borough between the cost of social renting and private renting. In Trafford, and I'm sure it's the same in many other districts within Greater Manchester. I'll give you an example. The cost of a socially rented 3-bedroom property in South Trafford is approximately £450 a month. The cost of a 3-bedroomed semi-detached property in South Trafford on the private market is £1,100 a month. So that is significantly different, as you can see. So, I mean, the one thing I will finish on is that in my own ward in Trafford, we have recently gone through a successful planning application for Carrington, which I'm sure as many of you are aware of, which is potentially a huge contribution to Greater Manchester's housing stock. There is nowhere near enough affordable housing provision in that development, nowhere near enough, but it will make a huge contribution to the figures. What I would like us to do is obviously press for the second and third phases of that development to include a lot more than the 10% affordable housing, if we get that, that it currently has. I think we should be going for a lot higher, double, maybe treble that amount, if we can possibly get there. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Pearce, you indicated.
Yeah. Just to a couple of points really. First of all, on sort of the affordable housing and the strategy we're developing, I think it's really important that affordable housing is integrated well into developments. Particularly, we've got the opportunity with sort of in the centre of towns and within the sort of city centre living, etc., to make that a possibility. I think zoning becomes very dangerous in terms of how we, how communities develop and the future. My other point, though, my main point really, is that sort of affordability is one angle, but actually poverty can be another, because they're not always seen as the same. For instance, there's probably a lot of people who are trapped in larger houses, which makes them obviously asset rich and cash poor, and a lot of people would want to move, I think, or if there was an attractive option to be able to do that. And I think what we need to do in the housing strategy across Greater Manchester is to address that point, because it would have the impact of releasing larger properties for those people who wanted them, but it would at the same time providing a better housing option for people who perhaps whose income isn't that great. But at the same time, I think what we need to be clear on is the mechanisms for enabling that to happen, because it's been an issue spoken of much in the past, but probably we've not very much found the strategy or the way to be able to deliver that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pearce. I think just adding to that, you talked about having the right housing available in city centres. I think as a councillor who represents a suburban ward, we need appropriate housing within town centres and village centres. And to Councillor Pearce's points about possibly smaller units, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about the role demographics are playing and the shifting demographics of the conurbation, how the role that's playing in your thinking, and then we'll draw on a line probably under this. Thank you.
Just picking up in terms of the land banking discussions with government, I mean, that is not necessarily in those terms, but that is part of the discussion with government. There is no doubt that people are sat on land for various reasons, and sometimes it's just simply that they bought it at the top of the market and at a value that they can't realise at the moment. But key to that, and the starting point I think for that, is some of the discussions we talked about land remediation before. And quite often the reason that land is not moving, particularly urban land, is that it's not viable. And so to some extent it's an opportunity for us, if we can have the resource available, to come alongside and try and help to make land viable and to get it out of that sort of position. And there is some mention, and there has been some mention from government about what was your phrase? Lose it or use it. Not quite, again, not quite those terms, but that is something that has started to become part of the language of government. But I think we're quite a distance off that. It is quite complicated. But there's a lot that can be done by helping people to unlock viability issues, using some of our powers. So that is something I think that can be done. In terms of Councillor Pearce's contribution, I, to some extent, find it hard to disagree with any of that. In terms of a lot of that should feature as part of a flexible housing strategy that's responding to the needs of local people. I think it's the fine grain of that is where the complications probably come in. And then in terms of demographics, Chair, you mentioned, I think at the moment that's something that is left to more local decision making, in both in terms of housing strategy terms and in planning terms as well. But there is an opportunity, I think, to make better sense of that across Greater Manchester through GMSF process, and I'm sure that Paul might want to add to that.
Yeah, no. In terms of changing demographics, I think we are starting to really consider the relationship between health and social care and housing. And indications of that are the emergence of things like extra care schemes and how those sort of schemes deal with issues of social isolation. They also deal with issues such as delayed transfers of care in terms of hospitals, admissions to GPs, all of that sort of stuff. So it is very much part of our thinking. The other side of that is how we provide accommodation for the future economy within Greater Manchester, and a lot of the young people now who seem to be choosing Greater Manchester as a place to live, work and play. But again, there's some challenges there, because I'm acutely aware that some of our young people working within the Greater Manchester economy are living in the private rented sector or cohabiting in the private rented sector because they can't afford to live on their own. So there is an affordability issue there, and that is very much part of our thinking. But clearly there's a relationship, isn't there, at the end of the day, between driving the economy into, you know, a successful place, both in terms of productivity, high skills, high paid employment, and our ability to pay growing rates of housing. But historically, if we look at wages and we look at housing growth, quite clearly wages have stagnated and housing growth has continued to grow, which is why we have the affordability gap we do. Tackling that has to be about growing the economy, trying to create those highly paid, highly skilled jobs, but it also has to be about getting a bit tougher, in my opinion, with with developers in terms of viability. I mean, you shared the example of Carrington, and when we look across the city region and across districts, it's quite clear to me that certain districts do better in terms of driving affordability within developments and ensuring contributions to things like Section 106. So for me, there's a piece of work to be done, arguably, to make sure that we have a skilled, competent workforce within our planning departments, within our regeneration teams across the city region, to ensure that we do drive, you know, a hard bargain when it comes to affordable housing and contributions to Section 106. We are looking at what's going on within the GLA in London at the moment. You've probably seen the paper that Sadiq Khan released where he talks about a 35% threshold on affordable housing. If developers don't come forward with a 35% threshold, he's then suggesting that the viability assessments become public. So there's full transparency around this, so the public can scrutinise the costs ultimately within developments. That's very much part of our thinking within the work around the housing strategy. So just to provide some level of reassurance, we are considering mechanisms. We're also negotiating, as has already been mentioned, the housing deal. We're looking at those issues of land remediation, because land values is pushing up development costs, which is pushing up housing prices, which is part of the issue here. We can't talk about housing in isolation of what's happening within the market for land within Greater Manchester. So just to reassure people, we are trying to consider the complexity of the situation and come up with some meaningful solutions to move us forward. What I would say on the issue of complexity, because I think it's been raised a few times, I personally believe that unless you're dealing with the complexity of the situation, it's very unlikely we'll be able to drive the outcomes we really want to see within Greater Manchester. It's not a choice to actually deal with the complexity here. It's obligatory if we are genuinely going to deliver the outcomes that the people of Greater Manchester need.
Thank you very much indeed for all of those comments and for the contributions of the committee. I think what we are asked as a committee to consider the data contained in the presentation. I think we can tick that box, and we can also use it to inform our priorities for the committee's future work. We have an item on the work programme later on our agenda, but I will certainly be raising housing strategy. I know it's a piece of work, it's a substantive piece of work that will be ongoing for some time. But I think I'd like to extend an open invitation to those who came to us today. If there's a piece of work coming out where you're publishing some draft thinking, where it's a marker, where it's a particular step that you'd like the contributions of this committee, I think you'd be very welcome indeed. And I'd also note Councillor Sherrington's point about best practice from around the districts, and I think we'll come back to that when we look at the work programme. So thank you very much indeed. I think we've covered item 5. You're very welcome to stay for the rest of this meeting, but we won't judge you unduly if you feel you need to be somewhere else. Okay, item 6, we have the Greater Manchester Transport Strategy 2040, a sustainable urban mobility plan for the future. Rod Fawcett is here, he's the Head of Policy for TFGM, and Nicola Kane, who is the Head of Strategic Planning and Research at TFGM. You are very welcome. You've given us a pleasingly small number of slides, so thank you very much for that. And you've used colours that are possibly slightly easier to determine than the combined authority slides before you. We were particularly interested in, as a committee, about integrated transport, and so we're very much looking forward to what you have to say to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we learnt our lesson from the last meeting that we attended in October. So what we've provided here is it's intended to respond to some of the members' comments about integration. And in particular, what we've tried to do is do two types of integration. Firstly, the strategic integration. So how is transport strategy informed by the Greater Manchester strategy and the spatial framework, and in turn informs those strategies? And then the second bit of integration is about transport modes themselves. How do we develop a public transport system where each of the modes supports and contributes to the other, and to make the network as easy to use as possible? Anyway, my colleague Nicola will whiz very, very quickly through these slides.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting us along today. I'm hoping most of you are aware that we published our 2040 strategy back in February this year, and it as Rod says, it forms part of a suite of new strategic documents which have either already been published or in the process of being developed. So we have the Greater Manchester Strategy, and we very much developed our 2040 in line with the principles and the driving ambitions of the previous strategy. I think equally it supports very well the ambitions in the new strategy. And we're working with colleagues on the spatial framework team to ensure we have an integrated approach to spatial planning and transport planning as we develop that document. So we are starting to think much longer term around transport and how transport supports a whole range of longer term ambitions for the city region. And we see this document as a sort of big step forward in really giving us the right framework we need over the next 20-25 years to develop our transport system. It's just worth saying that we did do a very extensive consultation on the document. So we started with a vision document, which we published back in 2015. We did a big public consultation on that. That then led to the development of the strategy itself. And the high-level document is supported by a 5-year delivery plan, which we'll be reviewing and refreshing every year. So although this does look very long-term, we've got a very flexible approach now that we have this 5-year delivery plan, which we'll keep reviewing, updating. So as new information comes forward on the spatial framework, for example, we can feed that information in and make sure that our transport plans respond appropriately. So as you'd expect, we started with the vision, which is very much about how transport supports a whole range of wider agendas. So how can it support delivery of sustainable growth, and particularly the housing that will be coming forward through the spatial framework and the new jobs across the city region. How do we make sure transport supports quality of life, whether that's social inclusion, whether that's around health benefits from getting people travelling more actively. Looking at the environmental impacts of transport and how we can start to reduce the air quality impacts in particular, and also thinking about carbon. We know transport is a major contribution to carbon emissions across the city region. And then looking at innovation. There's all sorts of innovations coming forward in transport, short term and longer term, and thinking about how we adopt the best of those new technologies, innovations to support our wider objectives. And I guess the key thing to note is that integration is the theme that runs through the whole document. So in our previous transport plans, we very much set them out around individual modes. We looked at what transport was needed in each of our districts. But this document really recognises that's not how people think about transport. They're looking for transport that meets their needs in terms of a wide variety of different journeys they're making. People are regularly crossing district boundaries. They're not necessarily aware of that. They don't really care which district they're travelling in. They just want to make sure they've got the right transport system to meet their requirements. So this document's much more about how transport shapes people's lives, enables them to access a whole range of opportunities, and also how it impacts on the places that it passes through. And really trying to develop that seamless transport system that enables people to do all of those things. So we set out in the document some network principles. These are a series of principles which we are looking to apply consistently across anything we do on the transport network. You'll notice integration is at the top there. That's sort of number one really in terms of delivering that more seamless transport system. We're also looking at how transport can support a more inclusive city region, how it can support health outcomes, environment, but also making sure that it's reliable, it's well maintained. Those probably less exciting things, but really important elements of having a well-functioning transport network. And this slide is probably a bit more difficult to read, so apologies, but thinking a bit differently around our different modes of transport as well. So we have public transport there again. A lot of the work we're doing around things like bus reform, which I know you heard about at your last meeting, is all about how we create that more integrated public transport network, enabling people to move more easily between different modes of public transport, taking away some of those interchange barriers that we have at the moment around fares, ticketing, service planning. And then looking at our highways network and recognising that highways don't just move cars and lorries, they move pedestrians, cyclists, buses, and we need to make sure our highway network is fit for purpose in terms of all of those different functions that it plays. And And then clearly walking and cycling is very high up on the agenda at the moment in Greater Manchester, and we now have Chris Boardman very much championing active travel. We see there being great potential for encouraging more people to make some of those short trips. We have about 1.8 million trips of a kilometre or less every day in Greater Manchester. About a third of those are made by car at the moment. So that's a sort of 10-minute walking trip. So how can we encourage people to leave their car at home for those very short trips, and what benefits that could bring to some of our local communities? And then round the edge of that graphic, you'll see lots of things which help us to deliver that more integrated system. So whether it's things like car clubs, cycle share schemes, looking at better travel information, smart ticketing, there's a whole range of elements that can help us to deliver that more integrated network. And then this diagram attempts to show what our vision of a more integrated public transport might look like. And this is at a fairly strategic level. So this is looking at some of our really key transport hubs and how we can start to connect them together more effectively, particularly if we can reduce some of the barriers around ticketing, for example, to enable people to move more easily between modes of transport. So we very much see our town centres, where we've been building new transport interchanges, as becoming much more important nodes of interchange across our network, enabling people to move not just into the regional centre, but also to move more easily between our towns and communities. And this last slide just gives a sense of some of the feedback we had when we did our consultation last summer. So we had about 1,800 detailed responses from members of the public across Greater Manchester. And we were pleased, probably slightly surprised at how often the word integration was used. We use it all the time as professionals, but that seemed to really resonate with members of the public, and they came back across a whole range of areas where they felt our transport network could be more integrated, and gave us lots of really useful feedback for how what specific integration challenges we'll need to address through the document. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour of the strategy. We're very happy to take more detailed comments and queries about the document. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that was a good overview of the issues around integration as a whole. I'm sure colleagues around the table have got questions in this area. I'm keen to keep them on integration. We've all got issues that we love to talk to colleagues from TFGM about our local bus routes and whether the bus stop can be fixed at the end of my road. But I'm going to keep us on topic of integration. Councillor Sherrington, first of all, please.
Thank you, Chair. I hope I'm sticking to the programme. What I wanted to talk about was the walking and the cycling side of this, because quite simply, I'm sure that a lot of people would gain from doing this, financially, if nothing else. But I do know people who've actually had a relationship with their company that they work for, where they've actually got a bike and actually paid for it through the company and this, that and the other, on the proviso that they actually used it to go to work and back and so on. But when they've come to actually do this, there is areas of our districts that are quite frightening to actually go down on a bike. And also if you're going in the morning when it's light or whatever, and you've got to come back and you're thinking about how you're going to come back, and you're going back through those areas, it's a concern. So I do, if we're thinking about making it better for walkers, we need more footpaths. If we are actually making it better for people riding bikes, then we do need to look at lighting and width of roads and all sorts of other factors, which I don't know whether we've got any money to do all that, but I do think if we're serious about doing this, that's the kind of thing that we need to do.
So you're suggesting that painting a bit of the carriageway a different colour is perhaps not sufficient in terms of addressing the needs of cyclists?
No, it isn't actually, and especially if you've got to go off. It's all right if you're, like you're running on where the bus runs, and all that. But sometimes when you go into work at a different company, you've actually got to go down some roads that are off the beaten track. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Sherrington. So cycle safety, I'm going to bring in Councillor Moore's question as well, and then if you could address both of those. Councillor Moore, please.
Thanks, Chair. Definitely one on integration. I noticed one of the slides in your presentation refers to the north and the other city regions in the north. I was wondering what work TFGM are doing with these other city regions at this stage to ensure that we have got collaboration over the integration. I was wondering, perhaps more of a political question, but what are your thoughts on the fact that the government have cancelled or at least cast out investment into electrification in the north? How do you think that's going to have an effect on us? And in general, I just think it's pretty disgusting that the government is putting more and more investment into London, which already has double the amount of money spent per head on transport, yet saying that they want a devolved north that's economically autonomous. I don't think it matches.
Please go ahead.
I'll start with the walking and cycling question. So I think we recognise that historically we've had massive underinvestment in particularly cycling networks in Greater Manchester. We've been working very hard to address that over the last few years, and I think we're getting close to spending around about £100 million on investing in new cycle networks. So that's included upgrading a number of our canal towpaths for walking and cycling, putting a lot of new cycle infrastructure on some of our main routes, with a particular focus on the city centre, but also doing some work in a number of our local towns and district centres to make them more cycle friendly. But we absolutely recognise that there's a lot more investment that needs to go in, and we're working with Chris Boardman at the moment on developing a new longer term walking and cycling strategy that will start to set out in a lot more detail what we think we need to do to upgrade that network. And I think alongside that, it will be important not just to put the infrastructure in, but to work with communities around training activities, perhaps addressing people's concerns about how long it might take to walk, encouraging people to try it, and perhaps because I think what happens is that if people drive a lot, they think it actually takes longer than it does to walk it. So there's a lot of engagement you can do actually going out about taking people out and walks in their local areas, building that confidence, building that understanding of where those local routes are. So I think there's a comprehensive strategy that we're working very hard to start to build, and we're hoping to publish something fairly early in the new year on that actually, which will hopefully give you much more clarity on the investment we think is required in walking and cycling.
Just in relation to the question about collaboration by cities and towns across the north, there's certainly been a lot of that over the recent years. So, for example, the new rail franchises of TransPennine and Northern Rail, they were effectively developed by the 30 or so transport authorities across the north coming together. And the service specification is better than what had happened previously. So it's a type of devolution that has allowed the north, as it were, to gain a little greater control over rail service specification for the north. There's only so far that you can get with service delivery on what is frankly ageing infrastructure, and I think that's where the real story is, and I think where TfN is really pushing hard. It's going to deliver its transport strategy for the north in the spring, and a lot of that is about cross-Pennine movements. And potentially a new link across the Pennines. And then the key commitment for that is making sure that government and the plural are going to be committed to the significant investments that that's going to require. In terms of the electrification point that you mentioned, I mean, the electrification was paused, and we still haven't formally found out, just giving you the line, just found out exactly what will happen as a consequence of that. But certainly the GM position, and that by many authorities across the north, was that commitments to increase the service capacity that electrification gives, because you can basically get more units down an electrified line than you can hitherto. They need to be maintained and committed. Now, we're not averse to looking at other potential solutions, but we just want to know what that is at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Councillor Robinson and then Councillor Wilson. Councillor Robinson.
When you decide you're going to discuss all this integration, I hope you don't leave out the disabled. I'll give you an example. Coming here today, Bury in Metrolink, the lift wasn't working, the escalator wasn't working. I got down one flight of stairs before one of the staff members decided to come and help me to get down the other flights of stairs, and then tells me that on my way back, get off at Radcliffe, ask one of the staff members to order you a taxi and we'll pay for it. Now I know for a fact when I've got off at Radcliffe before, there's never been any staff. So I'd be stuck there. So luckily our colleague happens to be here from Rochdale today who can help me get back from Radcliffe. So, but my concerns is it's all right saying get more people active, but we do have lazy people. We really do have lazy people. I'd love to be able to do all this walking and cycling. I'm not even allowed to drive anymore. So, and I'd love to be able to do all that. So please make sure when you do all this that you do take note of, and disabled people have a variance of disabledness, if you know what I mean. Some are more than others, but you do need to take that into account, please.
It's an important point raised by Councillor Robinson there. Councillor Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of bits of feedback. Firstly, it's good that some of the comments from the last meeting have been taken on board, particularly. I mean, we had conversations last time about London where it's the network's integrated enough that you catch a bus to the tube station and then go on from there. Just a Manchester issue, really. I'm sure there are many levels to this map that you put on the to demonstrate the integrated public transport system, but another kind of suggested hub would be Wythenshawe, really, because about 70,000 to 80,000 people live there. It functions as its own community, really, even though it's in the city of Manchester, but the public transport connections there are very poor related in comparison to the other, to South Manchester, the other side of the Mersey. So I think some thought about how that could be connected with the Greater Manchester network would be appreciated.
Thank you. Yes, on the disability issue, that is clearly hugely important, and Metrolink was designed in order to be a sort of easy to access public transport system. But however, things do fail, lifts do fail occasionally, and I will take that back. But certainly it's been the ambition to make sure that the mode that TFGM controls, which is the Metrolink mode, is as friendly and disabled access friendly as possible. And it's sort of part of the way that we've ensured that is by the use of an informal group, the Disability Design Reference Group, which comprises a sort of an informal grouping of lots of people who serve on that and give us advice on all sorts of things, service provision, infrastructure design, in order that when things get built, such as the new interchanges at Stockport and at Ashton and so forth, all the designs are looked at by this Disability Design Reference Group to build in best practice to make sure that they're as disabled friendly as possible, and that's a really crucial thing. So I hope that goes some way to reassuring you that's part of what we do.
I think the design at Bury is a bit out of date to start off with, and there's no car parking for anybody, hence my colleague has to park at Radcliffe.
I think that's right. Some of the earliest interchanges that were built, so I think Bury interchange dates from '92, which is the start of the Metrolink, are looking a little tired now, and so this is the point about infrastructure. It needs to be constantly refreshed, and this is sort of part of why we require a very forward-looking strategy up to 2040. What sort of a public transport system do we require, and what infrastructure is needed to serve that? That's really important to us.
Councillor Morgan mentioned that he wanted to come back on this point.
It's just a comment. In Bolton, we've just opened our new interchange. I have to say we've had quite a lot of criticism from the disability groups and visually impaired with regards to the design. There's so many steps and stuff. So I'm not convinced that happened. We've just opened ours, and I think it was 48 million. So I think that does need to be improved moving forward.
And as the councillor for Stockport, of course, I'd love to welcome the Metrolink to Stockport and all of its accessibility. Councillor Pearce, is it this point you'd like to come in on? Please go ahead.
I think it's obviously really good that you've got a disability group and a forum sort of which discuss designs with. But quite often these things are really complex, and it's quite, for visually impaired people, it's sometimes quite difficult to visualise what exactly is going to change and how it will work. I do think it's important that you're employing, in the same way that you'd employ sort of engineers, structural engineers and all the rest of it, that you employ somebody with a specialist knowledge in this area. I think it's too important to leave to sort of, I don't know what the status of the group is, whether it's volunteer or paid or whatever it is, but I think there needs to be a bit better coordination from what has just been said around the table.
A couple of councillors who want to come in on this point, so I'm going to bring them all in, and then if you could wrap up at the end. Councillor Sherrington, you indicated on this point, and then I'm going to bring Councillor Wright in.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a small thing relating to what's just been said. In Bolton, we actually do have a disabilities forum, and they did actually have a meeting with the TFGM about the new interchange there when they were actually putting the planning together on it, and they were very nice and everything when they came, but they didn't really take on board what was said basically. And like for instance, they've got a heck of a walk from Great Moor Street to the actual railway, because by the time you've got there, you've got to walk down to the stations and everything, which is and we actually did say that they could do with a travelator situation on there, of which it came back like that it was too expensive. However, there is other things that didn't get done the way that it should have been done to actually take on board the feelings, the strong feelings that they had from the Disabled Forum. And really, the Disabled Forum is there to actually take on board all the different types of disabilities of people who are trying their best to continue to be as independent as it possibly can be, which in the long term saves each and every district a lot of money. So I think we need to be doing more about that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. The lift issue is a major issue. I'm going to be completely honest with you. My mother's disabled, she's in an electric wheelchair. The lifts break down across the whole of the Metrolink network on a regular basis. And I'm going to give you one example which is appallingly bad, which is Sale Metrolink station. And it's not just about the fact that the lift keeps breaking down. To actually enter Sale Metro station if you're in an electric wheelchair, for example, or electric scooter, you can't actually get over the curb to get into the station without having assistance to be pushed over that curb because it's too high. So it's not actually disability accessible, that station. And I'm surprised that you've not had a challenge on it, to be quite honest, through the DDA. So just one example I wanted to give you. There's also, for disabled people, a lack of alternatives. So if the lift is broken at somewhere like Sale, for example, which you have to go down some steps, it's not street level, you have to go down some steps. What's the alternative for a disabled person at that point? How do they get down to the tram? They can't. There is no alternatives. So we need to be looking at alternatives to just lifts. Because if they can't use a lift, how do they get down there? If they need to get to work that day and they rely on the public transport system and they can't get down the lift, what do? Go home?
I think these are really crucial points for a huge number of residents across Greater Manchester. I wonder if actually at a future meeting we need to dig a bit further and a bit deeper into this and look at the way we're embedding accessibility into our strategies across the whole of Greater Manchester. So just throwing that in, I wonder if you could respond to the points that have been raised where appropriate, and whether you think it would make sense to dig deeper at a future meeting.
Absolutely. I think what might be helpful is at a subsequent meeting of this committee, we bring some of the project managers to explain how they go about the process of design and so forth, to give you an indication of how those issues and disability issues are taken on board. In relation to the some of the issues about particular stations and stops, I might suggest that if the clerk can pass those on to ourselves, we can get some specific answers to the specific questions that are raised, and I hope that's okay.
I think that, if that's acceptable to members, we'll agree to that. Councillor Wilson, was your question addressed? About Wythenshawe being a hub. I think that is a separate issue and it's not specifically about accessibility, so please could you address that?
Yeah, so the figure we put up there shows the sort of top 3 tiers of hub that we've identified within the strategy. I believe Wythenshawe is in the next tier down, and clearly we see Wythenshawe as being a really important interchange. We've built a new facility there that's now served by Metrolink, as well as a number of bus services. I still think there are barriers to interchanging between services, which again affect people across our interchanges. So we can provide the best facility in the world, but if the services aren't fully integrated that feed it, and if we don't have a fully integrated ticketing system, that creates a barrier to interchange. So that, you know, that's what we're trying to address through bus reform, through developing our ticketing offer. So it's something we're very aware of, but clearly Wythenshawe we do see as a very important interchange point within that part of South Manchester.
Thank you. Okay, I think I've taken everybody's comments. Councillor Walker, is it on integration?
It's on integration.
Can you? Okay, can you use your microphone, please?
2 points that I want to make. One is on one of the I understand that you're exploring the possibility of trying to take back into public ownership the stations across Greater Manchester, the commuter stations, and I think that would be a fabulous idea, and clearly one of the frustrations I think that we all have is that trains are more likely to be reliable than buses most of the time. But the beauty about trains is that if they arrive early, they wait at the station until the time to leave. They don't leave early. So they can't help but sometimes be late, but they do at least never leave early. Very often we have outside stations, and particularly I'm thinking of off-peak times, because at very busy times, sometimes not getting the next bus when you walk out of the station doesn't matter if you're on a route where there's buses every 10 or 15 minutes or whatever. But particularly in the evenings, for instance, when the service is cut down, it's very frustrating. One, when times don't coincide. So the worst thing in the world is to arrive, get off your train, and then have, you know, it's a half-hourly service, and you've now got half an hour to wait. And it's that lack of integration is very frustrating. But it's also even more frustrating if the bus, because the roads are quiet, zooms all the way through because it's had a good run, and finishes up not connecting with those train services. And I really think we need to be smarter about that particular issue. But the other thing that, and I think again, hopefully we'll be able to do more about this if we take back into ownership, but even without that, people are quite lazy about learning how to link services. So in my area, you've just introduced the Vantage service, which is guided busway for part of its route. Been very, very successful, very, very well used, and people are now learning about linking up. So they use that service almost like a train, because it's reliable, it's comfortable, and it's fast. So it's second best to a train, but it's very, you know, we do like it, and actually a lot more comfortable than the average train. But I do think that we have to think more about simple ways that people can understand how to use services like the train and like services like that to then move on for the last bit of the journey. Great if it's walking or whatever, but if it's using a bus, for instance, we have to be really good about good, simple signage so that people can get how they move on, because a lot of people aren't used to these new networks, and that will really enhance the service for everybody. And I think we can be a lot smarter about that integration of those services.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. I think you've made your point. If you could respond, please, that'd be excellent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. But in order to allow that easy integration, so that the bus meets the train, or that the information between the bus and the train is consistently presented to the passenger, or that the fare is well understood, and that your smart card becomes this embodiment of an integrated public transport system, that all requires, you know, a much more firmly regulated series of systems ultimately, and that goes back to the presentation that we went through last month, that we need effectively a much more influence over all those transport modes, so they don't compete with one another, they much more effectively collaborate with one another. That's the heart of what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much. If no colleagues around the table have got any further comments to make, I'd like to thank you both very much for coming along. I think that was a useful presentation. One observation I would make is that we've mentioned about 8 different strategies, what with the housing presentation before and the TFGM presentation now. And I think probably at some point this committee might like to learn about implementation of some of these strategies, not just the strategies. That's racy stuff, I know, but that's for a future meeting. Okay, thank you both very much indeed. Moving on to item 7, it's consultation on national infrastructure assessment. Councillor Walker mentioned at the beginning of this meeting about how we don't have an item that's explicitly on GMSF and an update on GMSF. My understanding is that this is here because it's all related. It's all much of a muchness. Housing and GMSF, employment land, housing land, is all about the infrastructure and how this fits in. We've got Anne Morgan and Eamon Boylan here who are going to present this report. Would you like to introduce it?
Thank you, Chair. This is not quite as substantive an item perhaps as the 2 we've had before, but I think we can see from the last 2 items we've had, infrastructure clearly is very, very important to everything we do. This is really to bring to members' attention the current consultation by the National Infrastructure Commission, which you may or may not have heard about. They were established in 2015 and they're there to advise government on future infrastructure requirements and strategy, and they're required to prepare a national infrastructure assessment once every Parliament. So they began this process last year. They had a call for evidence. We as Greater Manchester responded to that. We've given you a link to all of the responses. If you would like to specifically look at ours, we can circulate that to you. We raised several issues, particularly around how we could better work with infrastructure providers and with government, because the regulatory framework makes it very hard for us to actually plan for infrastructure as effectively as we want to, and also about the role of combined authorities which have devolved powers. This consultation highlights 7 areas. I think we wouldn't disagree with any of them, and they give us 28 detailed questions to respond to. We have identified infrastructure as important for Greater Manchester. It figures in the new GMS, our Greater Manchester strategy, and we have got quite a lot of groups who meet to talk about it, particularly the Infrastructure Advisory Group, which Eamon sometimes sits on, although he may now be passing that over to Steve Rumbelow, but brings together all of the main infrastructure providers. We'll be using all of those groups to gather their views on some of the questions, but really this was an invitation for you to give us any issues you think we should be taking into account, not necessarily just today, but feeding those to us over the next few weeks. Any detailed questions, David Hodcroft, who isn't a principal lawyer, but that would be quite interesting if he was, works with me in the planning and housing team, and he will be leading the coordination of, he is very principled though, but leading the coordination of the response. So any comments or any burning issues that you think we need to pick up, we'd be more than happy to do so. We are looking, because of the timescales, the deadline for this is January the 12th, so we will be taking this to the Combined Authority in December, which I think is only a couple of days after the next scrutiny, but we could circulate the draft response to this meeting, so at least you'll have a chance. Following Combined Authority in December, we will be asking, I think, for delegated authority for the lead for infrastructure to make any final changes, because we've got another month really to do that. So there are many opportunities for people to feed comments in. We just wanted to bring it to your attention as quickly as we could.
Thank you very much for that. I think the role of this committee is clearly not to answer the questions, but I would like to think that scrutinising a draft might make a lot of sense. I don't know how colleagues around the table feel about that. It only gives officers a couple of days, as you've just mentioned, but that's how I would have hoped and think we might work on that. We could all sit and answer the 28 detailed questions, many of which seem deeply sensible and the way of looking at things, but I'm not sure this committee is the right one to do that. Having a look at a draft that's been put together seems very sensible indeed. Eamon, are you looking to come in here?
I mean, certainly, Chair. I mean, if the committee is happy to do that, we can bring the draft back here and make certain that all of the comments and views of the committee are fed into the discussion at the Combined Authority. And we will have the best part of a calendar month, because I don't allow these people Christmas off, to work up the detail following on from both your input and that of leaders at the CA. So hopefully we can get to a good position. It's just worth mentioning that Andrew Adonis, who's the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, is visiting Manchester, I believe, next week at the invitation of the Mayor, to talk about a number of the key issues, in particular related to some of the major national infrastructure issues that we're concerned about, and specifically the interface of HS2, Classic Rail, and the aspiration for Northern Powerhouse Rail at Piccadilly, which is one of the most important infrastructure touch points for us, certainly, and I think for the whole of the north of England, if truth be told, that we need to highlight. So hopefully we can be able to make sure that the NIC says the right things about that when it publishes its report, but we'll bring the draft to you on the 13th of December.
If colleagues around the table are happy with that, did anybody have a burning issue that they felt needed to be fed in at this stage, or are we content to see a draft as it comes to our next meeting? One item I wanted to raise was just at the bottom, towards the bottom of page 4 of this report, which is page 60, item 7 that talks about financing and funding infrastructure. The bottom line there is, however, the GIB, which I'm guessing is Green Investment Bank, may change after privatisation, not prioritisation? Privatisation, thank you. Okay, if we're happy to receive something in December, let's move on to our next. Thank you, everybody, for coming along with that. I think it's useful for it to have been signposted to us that it's coming. The excitement will come in December, David. Sorry, Councillor Walker, are you wanting to come in at this stage, or are you happy to wait till December like the rest of the committee is with the draft?
Well, I didn't know whether it was relevant or not, because it doesn't seem to be included here, and it might be because it's too low level. But the point that was raised earlier by the Mayor and his colleagues about remediation on land, because that seems like quite a major structural issue, and I don't know whether it fits in with this little lot or not. If it does, then
Do you want to address that point now, and then we don't need to, or if it's appropriate, we can talk about it further in December, of course, but would you like to just address Councillor Walker's question? Councillor Walker.
Because it doesn't mention it anywhere, so it might not be relevant.
I need to ask now, can you turn your microphone off, Councillor Walker, please?
I think the National Infrastructure Commission isn't considering that that's part of its remit. I think quite interestingly, housing isn't part of its remit, although it identifies housing as that has the biggest need for infrastructure. But I think the land remediation issue isn't considered as infrastructure. I think they're looking at infrastructure as very much roads, power, and that sort of infrastructure. It's something that we could put in our response if we actually think, those things are important enough to be considered together. No, for across the piece, yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, moving on to item 8, which is our work programme. I'd like to thank Susan Ford, who is our Statutory Scrutiny Officer, and colleagues for working on filling out what was a fairly blank piece of paper when we started as a committee, and I think we're building up what looks like a really useful work programme. For the December meeting then, we've added the National Infrastructure Assessment draft response, so that's going to be added to the agenda as well. If there is something to note on GMSF as separate from that, we would welcome that, of course. We've got GM as a carbon neutral city region, and congestion. We are encouraged as committee members to be as specific as we can be in terms of what are we interested in, what do we want to hear, because if we say congestion, that's quite a broad area and it could be addressed in a number of different ways, and I think it would be really helpful to officers to know what we're interested in so that they give us relevant information and we can scrutinise or give overview on that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think there was one specific thing. The congestion was in fact the response to the mayoral, the recent mayoral consultation. So that was one specific area. But obviously, if there are particular aspects of that that you're keener on than others, please do let us know.
Thank you very much for that. January, we've got update on work on town centres. I think that's town centre living, regeneration of town centres, making sure our town centres are thriving. I'm particularly looking forward to that. Also in January, I think we talked with Rod and with Nicola. We had a lot of questions about accessibility and how is our transport network working towards making it accessible to everybody regardless of any disability or mobility issue that they may have. So really, I would love to see an item on that in January. So accessibility and embedding that across our strategy, across GM, I think that would be really useful. Housing strategy, probably a bit later in the municipal year, I think, looking at where that's up to. I think some work with Mayor Dennett and others about where that might fit in. Does anybody else have anything to add on that? Councillor Sherrington.
Could we have something regarding safety and feeling secure about actually walking around Greater Manchester and cycling around Greater Manchester? Because it's not all to do with, you know, whether you've got a path there or whatever, it's whether the lighting's right, you know, whether you feel that safe. You know, it's that feeling of being safe, basically. And there's quite a lot of areas that are so-called cycling and walking areas that are quite frightening in our Greater Manchester. So I do think that we need to be probably looking at that as well.
We'll take that on board, certainly, and we'll look at where that best fits in.
But I was just wondering whether that could just fit in with what we're doing regarding the other stuff.
On accessibility?
Yeah.
Certainly.
Just say, because
it's
it won't be a big issue, it's just...
No, I think you're right, Councillor Sherrington. We're looking, I suppose, at the barriers that are stopping people from cycling and from walking. Yeah. And if they don't feel safe, they're not going to do it. Exactly. And I think that's safety while cycling, and it's safety if you're going down a dark woodland path. Do you feel differently there than if you feel in a well-lit residential area? So I think it's an important point, and I think we'll ask officers to come with some comments on that, so thank you for that. One of the things, Councillor Roberts, I'll bring you in one sec. One of the things we had talked about as a committee is that not everything needs to be as part of a committee meeting, that sometimes we need some training on issues that aren't necessarily needing to be minuted and part of a public meeting. Some training on transport investment has been suggested ahead of the December meeting. So funding of transport projects, investment in transport, and how we get the change that is in the strategy, how we get that implemented. And so that's been talked about. Are colleagues agreeable that a 5 p.m. training session ahead of the next meeting at 6 p.m. in December? You can battle your way through the Christmas markets and make it here possibly with a small plastic cup of Glühwein or something. That might be appropriate. Okay, so let's go ahead with that for December. Councillor Roberts, you wanted to contribute.
I was just wondering, and I can't remember the details and timing, but when we discussed previously the issues about buses, there was some work being done around what the implications might be about bus regulation for provider, and I wondered if us having a look at what comes out of that might be sensible.
Seems, I can see the excitement in Rod's face.
Delighted to oblige.
You'd be delighted to come. That's excellent. The other thing that we've mentioned a few times is about waste and how the Waste Disposal Authority is going to transfer into being a waste committee. There's going to be a little bit of work done between the chairs of the scrutiny committees as to where these things fit in. Waste will come under the remit of this committee, but of course it's a corporate issue as well, looking at the transference of the Waste Disposal Authority into the combined authority. So I'll come back to you. I'm meeting with the other chairs of the scrutiny committees next week, and I will report back to this committee when we meet next in December. On that note, let's move to item 9, which is the date and time of next meeting. Sadly, slightly less grand surroundings for our next meeting, colleagues. We will be at Churchgate House rather than in the Lord Mayor's parlour. But hopefully that works for everybody and is accessible to all. So on that note, I will leave it there. I will see you all in December. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions, everyone. Thank you.